In 1983, Paul de Vries, a philosophy professor at Wheaton, a conservative Christian liberal arts college, introduced the term methodological naturalism into the discussion of how scientific and religious belief are related. His claim was that as a matter of method, scientists, whatever their metaphysical beliefs, should always posit a natural cause for any event that takes place in the natural world. Proponents, both secular and religious, insist that adopting such a method in no way commits one to any particular metaphysical position, since, quoting, "Science is naturalistic only on the level of its methodology, but is neutral with respect to metaphysics," end quote. Thus, given its presumed metaphysical neutrality, methodological naturalism provides a way in which science can be pursued by those with differing worldviews. The presumed insulation of methodological naturalism from any kind of metaphysical commitment is, in my view, an illusion. What one thinks to be the nature of reality cannot be neatly separated from the methods one uses to investigate it. By analogy, if, for example, one believes that there exist or may possibly exist mental states which play a causal role in determining bodily behavior, it makes no sense to adopt methodological behaviorism, since its adoption guarantees the development of psychological theories in which mental states either do not exist or play no causal role in such behavior. Only if one has already established beyond reasonable doubt that mental states do not exist, or if they do exist, play no causal role, does it make sense to insist on methodological behaviorism as a prerequisite of developing psychological theories. To insist on its employment in the absence of compelling reasons for disbelieving in the existence of mental states or their causal powers is to beg the question of whether its adoption is justified. Similarly, if one has not established beyond reasonable doubt that supernatural agents do not exist, or if they do, they never intervene on natural processes, does it make sense to insist that explanations of physical events must restrict themselves to natural causes? A further reason to question the easy acceptance of methodological naturalism is that there is no clear way to demarcate science from non-science. Not only do proposed demarcation criteria prove inadequate, they are typically employed polemically as discrediting devices, as machines of war, whereby one can dismiss an opponent's position as unscientific and thus unworthy of being taken seriously. Thus, for example, the arguments made by intelligent design theorists are routinely dismissed without serious examination on the grounds that they are deemed unscientific. It is clear, therefore, that proponents of adopting methodological naturalism need to justify their insistence that scientific investigation must never take into consideration the possibility of a supernatural cause of observed phenomena. This, as we shall see, is no easy task. Proposed justifications of methodological naturalism. Those questioning methodological naturalism as a prerequisite of science are frequently dismissed on the basis that they are creationists. Unfortunately, such dismissals equivocate on the term creationist to the extent that it comes to mean anyone who questions the acceptance of methodological naturalism. If, however, one takes the term creationist on its more usual use as referring to those who believe the earth is less than 20,000 years old, then it's clear that many critics of methodological naturalism who are not creationists and indeed not even theists. More fundamentally, such a justification fails since it's clearly a case of the ad hominem fallacy. Whatever the motivations of those questioning methodological naturalism, what should really be at issue is the arguments they present. If one wants to show that Richard Dawkins' views on evolution are mistaken, one must examine his arguments and not simply observe that he finds evolution an attractive theory on the basis that it provides a materialist origin story. Similarly, if one wants to dismiss critics of methodological naturalism, one must do it by showing their arguments to be mistaken rather than questioning their motives. Second attempt at justification. Science in principle excludes any recognition of the supernatural. Many proponents of methodological naturalism insist that by definition, science cannot ever contemplate the existence of supernatural causes. Robert Pinnock insists that methodological naturalism is, quoting, a scientific ground rule. That is to say, quoting again, as a point of method, science does not countenance appeals to the supernatural, end quote. On such a view, methodological naturalism constitutes a necessary, though not sufficient, condition of scientific investigation, and thus serves to at least partially demarcate science from other disciplines. There are at least two reasons to reject such a justification of methodological naturalism. First, in the absence of argument as to why science must exclude recognition of the supernatural, it amounts to an arbitrary stipulation. If one wants to claim that science prohibits ever recognizing a supernatural cause, then one must provide reasons why this is the case, not simply define such an embargo into existence. Second, demarcationist proposals are notorious for failing to provide necessary or sufficient conditions to distinguish science from other disciplines. Making the important distinction between what may be termed nomological science and historical science further compounds the difficulty inherent in such an enterprise. Paul Draper notes that, quote, scientists engaged in nomenological science formulate laws, models, and other interesting if-then generalizations, often testing them by experiment and prediction, and making inductive generalizations based on observable data. In historical science, on the other hand, not all causal explanations fit the covering law model, and many hypotheses about the past cannot be falsified and cannot be tested by prediction or experiment. Instead, they are judged on their simplicity, their fit with general background knowledge about the world, and their ability to explain specific known facts. What all this shows is that methodological naturalism cannot be adequately defended by describing something called the scientific method, then arguing that it cannot be applied to the supernatural. For more likely than not, the method described would be characteristic of nomenological science, while appeals to the supernatural would naturally be used to answer historical questions, end quote. Third attempt at justification. Supernatural causation implies a chaotic universe. Not infrequently, advocates of methodological naturalism attempt to justify its acceptance by claiming that taking seriously the possibility of supernatural agency implies a chaotic universe. They maintain that taking seriously such a possibility implies that, quote, God may simply zap anything into or out of existence. In any situation, any pattern or lack of pattern of data is compatible with the general hypothesis of a supernatural agent unconstrained by natural law, end quote. We cannot simultaneously live in a world of natural causation and of miracles, for if one miracle can occur, there is no limit, end quote. At every instant, all physical regularities may be ruptured and a totally unforeseeable set of events may occur. Aside from the deep conceptual confusion involved in suggesting that choosing a certain methodology determines whether in fact the universe is chaotic, several criticisms are in order as concerns this attempted justification. First, it is generally recognized that science originated and developed in a Western Christian intellectual environment. Quoting from Rach, science works only in a very particular sort of reality and only with a very particular sort of conception of reality. The requisite picture of a comprehensible, intelligent, uniform, predictable, even beautiful cosmos which can in principle make sense to finite minds like ours when observed via perceptual faculties like ours, is a picture of a cosmos structured like a creation. Although details are disputed, that Christian doctrines of creation of divine voluntarism provided a hospitable matrix for science is not in dispute." End quote. So at the very least, it is historically clear that belief in the reality of supernatural causation did not hinder the development of science. Second, it does not follow that admitting the reality of supernatural agency would imply that anything goes, that on the hypothesis of theism, God is liable at any moment to zap anything into or out of existence. What God freely wills will be in accordance with his nature and not simply arbitrary or irrational. As Evan Fales, an atheist, notes, it does not follow from the fact that God is a free agent that his purposes and behavior, including the occasional performance of a miracle, cannot be made intelligible or studied in systematic ways. Third, those maintaining the reality of supernatural causation offer criteria by which phenomena best understood as requiring a supernatural cause as opposed to a natural cause can be identified. One may wish to dispute whether these criteria are effective, but the fact that they are proposed and that supernatural causation is advocated in the realm of historical as opposed to nominological science makes clear that openness to the possibility of supernatural causation does not commit one to abandoning belief in an orderly universe amenable to human investigation. Fourth attempt at justification. Allowing for the possibility of supernatural causation is a science stopper. Defenders of methodological naturalism often make the claim that taking seriously the possibility of supernatural causation is a science stopper. It is argued that at the psychological level, scientists will become lazy and liable to abandon the search for natural causes for phenomena. And at the conceptual level, that explanations in terms of supernatural causes are not falsifiable. Warnings abound that any openness to considering a supernatural cause will bring the scientific enterprise to a grinding halt. Once again, there are reasons to question such an assumption. We have already noted that belief in the reality of supernatural agency did not hinder scientific development. We have also noted that the postulation of supernatural causation typically occurs regarding historical rather than nomenological science. Neither is it the case that once proposed or even accepted, that supernatural explanations cannot be challenged or discarded. Competing explanatory hypotheses are hardly unknown to science. To take a case in point, the fact that biological entities exhibit the informational patterns typically associated with intelligent agency, and that scientific investigation tends to emphasize the inadequacy of solely natural causes to account for the genesis of such structures, in no way implies that research cannot, or is not likely to, continue regarding the possibility of demonstrating that a plausible naturalistic account of such origins can be given. If such a plausible account emerges, then it will constitute reason, I would suggest on the basis of Occam's razor, to reject an explanation in terms of supernatural agency. Further, the insistence that it's never permissible to posit a supernatural cause for a physical event means that if such causation in fact takes place, it can never be recognized. Unless one is prepared to defend metaphysical naturalism on an independent basis, acceptance of methodological naturalism as essential to the pursuit of science requires that we understand science not as committed to pursuing the truth about reality, but rather as to pursuing the best natural explanation that can be formulated of a phenomenon. Thus, acceptance of methodological naturalism requires that no matter how implausible a naturalistic explanation for the origin of life might be, it will be taken seriously so long as it is only slightly less implausible than competing naturalistic explanations. even if life did originate through supernatural agency, and even if it bears the characteristics of things we know to be intelligently designed, acceptance of methodological naturalism prohibits ever contemplating such an explanation. Similarly, methodological naturalism prohibits ever recognizing an event, no matter the context and circumstances in which it occurs, as a miracle. Thus, if convinced that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, a consistent methodological naturalist must presume that the event does in fact have a natural explanation. Fifth attempt at justification. Theological considerations require that there be no supernatural intervention in nature. Methodological naturalism is sometimes defended on explicitly theological grounds. These take the form of assertions that the perfection of God implies that his purposes in the world must be accomplished exclusively, perhaps in the case of the more conservatively minded, an exception being made for salvation history, by means of secondary created causes. Nature, it is asserted, is, to use Howard Van Til's phrase, fully gifted, and any supernatural intervention by God in creation would be coercive and inconsistent with God's perfect love. There are at least two reasons to see such theological justifications as carrying little weight. First, even the most cursory examination reveals that they are question-begging and employ rhetorically loaded language. We are informed, quoting here, the notion of God as a cosmic magician meddling with matter is offensive. It would be a very poor sort of God who created a universe that wasn't right and then tinkered with it at a later stage. And that a God who uses the openness of his created universe to insert additional causal events from time to time into that universe to produce particular events or trends would be a meddling demigod, a moral monster, a contradiction of himself. Reasons, however, why God's perfection requires no supernatural intervention in the natural order are noticeably lacking, as are arguments why such intervention should be understood as meddling or tinkering. One is expected to accept that belief in supernatural intervention in nature necessitates viewing God as either a moral monster or a bumbler who, not getting things right the first time, must adjust an ill-thought-out plan in an ad hoc manner. The possibility that God at times acts directly within creation, that inorganic chemicals were never intended to have the capacity to self-assemble into living entities, is ruled out a priori with no need to consider actual empirical evidence. Second, such justification is inconsistent with their proponents' claim that methodological naturalism is metaphysically neutral. The methodology they insist upon is grounded in their metaphysical commitment to a non-interventionist God. Far from being metaphysically neutral, it is an outworking of their deistic or semi-deistic view of God's relation to creation. That is to say, their insistence that God be viewed as acting exclusively or almost exclusively through the instrumentality of secondary material causes. Sixth attempt at justification. Methodological naturalism is inductively justified. Philosophically astute proponents of methodological naturalism, both theists and non-theists, have increasingly tended to defend it not as necessarily constitutive of doing science, but as based on a well-evidenced inductive generalization that proves fruitful. Writing from a Christian perspective, MacDonald and Trow are happy to agree that methodological naturalism is not an essential or definitional aspect of science, that there are, quoting, no clear a priori reasons to exclude the supernatural from science. Rather, they insist it's an empirically validated methodology and as such should be honored until a better framework comes to the fore. Similarly, metaphysical naturalists Boudre, Blanc, and Brockman reject the conception of methodological naturalism as an intrinsic limitation of science defending it, quoting here, as a provisory and empirically grounded attitude of scientists, which is justified in virtue of the consistent success of naturalistic explanation and the lack of success of supernatural explanations in the history of science. This, of all the proposed justification of methodological naturalism, is the most promising. Nevertheless, it is far from convincing. First, at the level of actual practice, methodological naturalism functions not so much as a provisional inductive generalization, helpful in guiding scientific investigation, but rather as an absolute prohibition on ever taking seriously the possibility of supernatural causation. Most of us will be familiar with Lewontin's quote here. He writes, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence of material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Fundamental explanatory virtues such as simplicity, coherence, scope, etc., serve to adjudicate competing explanations, whether they be natural or supernatural, without any need to invoke methodological naturalism as adding some further necessary criterion. Second, and more importantly, the inductive generalization which is presumed to justify methodological naturalism is far less secure than generally portrayed. This is so for several reasons. First, at a historical level, there are many factors which explain the move away from theories of supernatural agency, that is to say, design inferences. Many of these are, quoting Rach, scientifically irrelevant, and to the extent that they drove the history, to that extent, the history too will be irrelevant. Further, it seems fair, end of quote. Further, it seems fair to observe that the rejection of present-day design inferences should be based on present-day science. By way of analogy, Rach notes, quoting here, were one attempting to show that phlogiston theory really should not be resurrected within present science, one surely would not have to rely on reference to difficulties raised a couple of centuries back. If phlogiston theory is indeed dead, we'd better be able to develop a case out of present science for thinking so. If we can't, then present science is in extraordinarily deep trouble. Second, as has been noted, appeals to supernatural agency are not typically found regarding how things work, but rather how they come to exist in the first place. Questions of the origin of the universe and its apparent fine-tuning, and questions of the origin and development of life are questions of historical rather than nomological science. It is in these areas of scientific investigation that one encounters appeals to supernatural agency, that is to say, design inferences. Once this distinction is made, the success that nomenological science has had in finding natural causes of phenomena cannot automatically be taken as providing a strong inductive argument for adopting methodological naturalism in historical sciences. The fact that turtles are easy to catch hardly provides warrant for thinking that cheetahs will be easy to catch. And the fact that natural explanations in nomenological science have enjoyed great success scarcely warrants the assumption that explanations in terms of natural causes in historical science will enjoy the same degree of success. Indeed, any inductive argument regarding cosmological and biological origins seems to be on the side of design inferences. A little over a century ago, it was possible to view the universe as eternal, and the structure of living cells was relatively simple. This is no longer so. The more we know, the harder it is to avoid positing design regarding origins. Our best cosmology points to our finely tuned universe coming into existence without any natural cause. Similarly, although structures that manifest redundant order, for example crystals, or simply complexity, for example, mixtures of random polymers, are easily found in nature, but none of them exhibit the specified complexity, that is to say, the information that exists in DNA, RNA, and proteins. Such structures recalcitrantly resist explanations in terms of any known natural causes, so much so that James Tours, one of the top-ranked chemists in the world, is prepared to say in his 2016 Pascal lecture, The Origin of Life, an Inside Story, that there presently exists no natural account of life's origin that is even faintly plausible. It's important in this regard to realize that the argument I'm presenting does not commit the fallacy of ad ignorantium. The inference to supernatural agency is based not simply on the repeated inability of scientists to produce plausible natural explanations in these areas, but on the fact that the phenomena being investigated display characteristics that, in our experience, are the product of intelligent agency. As Stephen Meyer notes, the inadequacy of proposed materialistic causes forms only part of the basis of the argument for intelligent design. We also know from broad and repeated experience that intelligent agents produce information-rich systems. Experience teaches that whenever large amounts of specified complexity or information are present in an artifact or entity whose causal story is known, invariably creative intelligence, that is to say intelligent design, played a role in the origin of that entity. Thus, when we encounter such information in the large biological molecules needed for life, we may infer, based on our knowledge of established cause and effect relationships, that intelligent cause operated. The argument asserts the superior explanatory power of a proposed cause based on its proven, its known causal adequacy, and based upon a lack of demonstrated efficacy among the competing proposed causes. End quote. Further, there are scientific disciplines where design inferences are routinely made. Archaeologists, for example, are willing to identify primitive tools precisely on the basis that what they're looking at bears the type of structure we know to be produced by intelligence. And the SETI project is looking to see if there are signals from space that exhibit a pattern requiring intelligence to explain. These appeals to design appear to be accepted because they are not presumed to challenge a naturalistic account of how conscious intelligent agents originated. It is only when the design would have to be attributed to a supernatural intelligent agent that the design is judged to be only apparent and not genuine. This, however, is to ignore the fact that the question of whether an object is designed, that is to say the product of intelligent agency, is distinct from the question of the designer. If one goes to a faraway planet and finds symbols on a cliff face that turn out upon inspection to demonstrate the impossibility of trisecting the angle and doubling the cube, one will have no hesitation in identifying that mathematical proof as the result of intelligence, even if one has no idea as to the identity of the agent responsible. Given that the recognition of intelligent design is logically prior to the question of the designer's identity, it will not do to reject what appears to be instances of design on the basis that, if recognized as genuine, they constitute evidence for a supernatural designing intelligence. Conclusion. I have argued that methodological naturalism, contrary to its proponent's claim, is not metaphysically neutral. I have further argued that its acceptance as a practice requires justification. Unfortunately for its advocates, attempts to justify it are failures. It cannot be defended as a definition or a self-imposed limitation of science, nor, more modestly, as an inductively justified commitment to natural causes. Its rejection, however, in no way prohibits scientists from searching for natural causes of physical phenomena. The issue is not whether it's legitimate to look for natural causes of phenomena, but rather whether science must or should, in all circumstances, confine itself to attempted explanations in terms of natural causes, no matter how inadequate such attempted explanations prove. Whether in science or other endeavors, one needs to be free to go where the evidence leads. If the best explanation for some events or structures is direct supernatural agency, then science needs to be able to have access to it. Any methodology which precludes such access acts not to further scientific investigation, but rather to place it in an explanatory straitjacket. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Larmer. I now invite to the stage Dr. Georg Gasser from the University of Innsbruck for a response.
The central hypothesis of Professor Larmer's paper is that methodological naturalism cannot be completely isolated from its ontological presuppositions. If one aims at pursuing methodological naturalism, then one is also operating with an implicit naturalistic ontological framework. The acceptance of these presuppositions, however, needs to be justified. One has to explain why scientific investigation must never take into consideration the possibility of a supernatural cause for the explanation of a natural phenomenon. Such a justification, Professor Larmer argues, is harder to establish as it generally assumed. I agree with Professor Larmer that some arguments put forward against referring to supernatural causes for the explanation of natural phenomena are rather weak and not convincing. For instance, that supernatural causation implies automatically chaos, or that it is a science stopper. However, I do believe that maintaining methodological naturalism as a ground rule for doing science is to be preferred over a scientific methodological account involving references to supernatural causes. One reason is that methodological naturalism appears to me to be much more flexible, as Professor Larmer seems to suggest in his paper. Given the limited amount of time for my response, I will focus just on one issue, which figures prominently in the paper. I start with Professor Larmer's reference to Paul Draper's distinction between nomological and historical science. Draper argues that the supernatural may be used to answer questions concerning historical science. A similar line of argument, so it seems to me, has been put forward by Professor Swinburne, who distinguishes between natural and personal explanations. He says that a personal explanation explains an object or an event in terms of a person and her purposes. So we know of regularities in succession, things coming about because someone intentionally brings them about, that are caused by the activity of the person. The hypothesis that a designer exists and created the universe with its natural order provides such a personal or historical explanation for the order of nature and the origin of life in it. If there is no adequate scientific explanation for these phenomena, then one should accept the design hypothesis. Not being a natural scientist, I cannot competently evaluate the claim, as Professor Larmer makes on page 10 of his paper, that up to date there is no naturalistic account of life's origin that is even faintly plausible. However, even if an explanation in terms of a designer might be technically the best, because there is no better explanation available at the moment, we still might not accept it if it is not also a good explanation. One important criterion for good explanations is whether an explanation is simple or not. Occam Razor says that we should not multiply entities beyond necessity. So the reference to a designer for the explanation of a natural phenomenon introduces a new kind of entity, a person or an intelligent being, next to natural entities. So if a designer is necessary to explain the phenomenon in question, then the explanation respects Occam's razor, otherwise it does not. Therefore the question is it necessary? Here is one alternative explanation. Matter over infinite time comes to be arranged by chance as if it were designed. The proponent of the designer account might consider such an explanation to be unsatisfying, because in the light of the amount of order in the universe and the universal applicability of laws of nature, a personal explanation looks superior over an explanation referring to mere chance. It is just too implausible, such a proponent might say, that a universe evolves by chance, that the design explanation, and therefore the design explanation is much more plausible. At this point, the proponent of methodological naturalism can resort to a theory which has some growing popularity in recent times, and that lowers the argumentative weight of the implausibility objection, the multiverse theory. Suppose that instead of just one universe, our universe, there are many or even infinite many different universes. Each had randomly different scientific laws, and in most cases the laws didn't allow for stable universes. Hence, as soon as the universes began, they also ended. Or maybe other universes existed for some time, but the development of order was so limited that they collapsed also after a certain period of time. Now, given all these possible universes and all the possible variations in it, a universe such as ours might come to exist through chance eventually. It doesn't need any special non-natural explanation, and it isn't that unlikely that such a universe as ours, with the order in it, evolves. This explanation can be compared with a lottery scenario. It is very unlikely that you will win the lottery. However, it is quite likely that someone will win it. For whoever wins, that this person won is a huge coincidence, but we don't need any special explanations for it. Thus, an inference to supernatural agency does not seem to be required. On the one side, a naturalistic explanation is available, and on the other hand, we also have an experiential basis, such as a lottery scenario, that this scenario must not be the product of intelligent agency. At this point, two considerations arise. One might think that the existence of a designer is a simpler explanation. There's just one designer and not millions of different universes. On the other hand, the designer is a new kind of entity, whereas we already know that universes can exist, and there we have only one kind of entity. A designer as such, that's my second point now, a designer as such might not be the right kind of entity. For most people inclined, or principally inclined to accept a personal explanation for the existence of our universe, have often some religious motives. Thus, they would have to show that the designer has also the traditional properties ascribed to a theistic God. If so, one may refer to other evidence for supporting this view, for instance, religious evidence, or some religious experience, because the hypothesis that God has created this designed universe should fit with what else we know about the universe and our existence in it. At this point, however, a proponent of methodological naturalism might say that we also have ample evidence against the existence of such a God. Think, for instance, about the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness. So all things considered, theories about the universe origin, what we know about the behavior of intelligent beings like ourselves and so on, the non-existence of God might look more likely than God's existence, or the existence of an intelligent designer with the properties that were traditionally ascribed to God. And at least cosmological theories do not seem to provide evidence against the existence of other universes, even if there are millions of different universes. I would like to stop here due to my limited amount of time. I structured my discussion in a dialectic way for making 2 points explicit. First, a proponent of methodological naturalism has a variety of resources at hand for defending the claim that the origin of the universe and of intelligent life in it can be explained naturalistically. It was my impression that Professor Larmer's picture of a naturalistic explanation or of an explanatory basis was more pessimistic in this respect. My second point, the development of this variety of resources goes hand in hand with an analysis and confrontation with alternative explanatory accounts, such as the design hypothesis. Excluding such alternatives due to its non-naturalistic implications from the onset does not seem to be justified, and such an exclusion might even present a science stopper because possible challenges to overall naturalistic accounts are less likely to be taken into consideration. Thus, here I share Professor Larmer's position that one has to evaluate the adequacy of the different possible explanations. A final point, the discussion about the origin of the universe and the natural order is less a discussion immanent within a specific scientific theory rather than a discussion about the existence and ultimate features of reality as a whole. Again, here I share Professor Larmer's claim that ontological presuppositions about reality's overall features are prior to methodological concerns. If one takes naturalism as ontological thesis for granted, then methodological naturalism is a logical consequence of it. If one does not take naturalism for granted, then one might push methodological naturalism as far as possible, however, with a caveat that certain phenomena might be better explained in the light of personal or historical explanations. The origin of the universe and of life in it might be such phenomena. However, I try to indicate that the explanatory naturalistic resources for these phenomena are stronger, as Professor Larmer's paper seems to have suggested. Thank you.
I would agree that what seems probable on a certain body of evidence would be revised if further evidence comes in. So I would see that if you propose a supernatural explanation for an event, if you have further evidence that might undermine a supernatural explanation. My concern is that methodological naturalism not be used in such a way that it precludes that possibility of undermining. As regards Occam's razor, I think the key word is needlessly. Don't multiply entities needlessly. The theist will say that we have evidence that requires positing a personal explanation. When we talk of the multiverse, I think it would be a good thing if we inquire what the evidence for a multiverse is. Also in terms of when we talk of, say, eternal universes and possibility of chance, our best explanation, so our best science suggests we don't have an eternal universe. So this is all to say that I don't think we can resolve these things from our armchair. We are looking for a broad overall explanation of everything. So methodological naturalism, I think we have to ask, how does it fit in the broad overall picture? For example, when we talk of personal explanation, we routinely explain things in terms of a person's purposes, telos, etc. Well, that raises the question of the mind-body relation. If you're a substance dualist, as I am, I would say that we have ample evidence for non-physical causes all over the place. So that when we're talking of God, we have, by analogy, very good reason for positing such an agent.